Good morning, everyone. I'm Asha Nayaswami, and we're here continuing with our shelter in place. Today, we're continuing our conversation about the 8 manifestations of God. Today, we'll talk about wisdom. But first, let's pray together. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master, Paramhansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, dear friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Inspire us with your wisdom. Help us to see clearly among the many choices life presents us, those actions and thoughts, feelings and aspirations, which will lead us most quickly and certainly to the divine fulfillment we all long for. Om. Peace. Amen. All right, everyone. So, wisdom. Someone asked me a question, which was a fun question when it was asked. I may have mentioned this already, so if I'm repeating myself, forgive me. They asked me, what of the 8 manifestations of God, which ones are your favorites? And I think by asking which are your favorites, it's also partly asking which ones are the most natural and the most helpful and useful to you. So I had to say, first of all, joy, because that was really my motivation in getting onto the path in the first place. That was the impelling force from my childhood, was the experience of joy. I was basically a pretty cheerful person, but also a deep understanding that the entire purpose of life was joy. I called it happiness then. I've come to understand joy and bliss as deeper meanings. But I could tell, even from childhood, before I had any real concept, sometimes we look back on our childhood and we didn't have the language, but we had the understanding, because when you die as an old person, having fulfilled an incarnation and accumulated skills and wisdom and understanding and life experience, and then your body's finished and it goes away, your whole consciousness goes with you. It doesn't like disappear. You don't start over from zero. It's a continuing story in reincarnation. And so when you reincarnate in a small body, that body, by the nature of human life, is very helpless. It's tiny and helpless and inarticulate, but it's not stupid. The whole of your consciousness is in there, the whole of your intelligence, the whole of your karmic potential, your talents, everything. It's all there. It just can't express itself yet, or it can't express itself in a way that the society around you expects. The vibrations are there. The whole story of the 3 wise men coming to visit Jesus in the manger, and Jesus is a baby in the manger, but the 3 wise men come to pay homage to him because his consciousness is not defined by that body. It's just his consciousness is animating that body and giving it life force so it can grow up, so that it can become a vehicle capable of expressing who he is. So when I look back on my childhood, and I only have certain memories, it's not, the whole thing is not vivid, I see many points in which I was acting from a very sophisticated understanding of reality. I didn't have the words to say it, and I certainly didn't have the concepts until I found out about Sanatana Dharma. But the impulses and the understandings were absolutely true and totally sophisticated, not even slightly childlike. The only thing childlike was the way I expressed them, because after all, surprise, surprise, I was a child. There you have it. But my understanding that the only valid objective of life, I called it to be happy, but what I meant was to experience bliss, to have a kind of happiness that was going to be independent of the ups and downs of life. I just knew that was the purpose of life. And I was so frustrated because nobody seemed to want to teach me about it. They just would teach me these, to me, utterly irrelevant things unless, the foundation behind them was this quest for joy. So I was never interested in anything except theater. Theater, for some reason, gave me joy, and I had a feeling about it. I can't say just more than that. But I loved theater. I loved acting. I loved the stage. I loved all of that. But everything else, I just watched. Like literally, I felt like I was standing against the wall watching. But wisdom, I remember also, now that I think about it, a very interesting experience when I was about 13. I'm not a large person, and I was a small child, and I was skinny, and I didn't develop. I didn't have puberty. Didn't come early for me, and even when it did, I was still just a skinny little kid. And all of my friends, for some reason, became quite voluptuous and attractive much earlier than I. So I was sort of walking around basically with these full-grown women, looking just still like a little stick of a child. That's sort of why I say to people that I developed my witty personality, because I wasn't going to get any attention, as one man put it perfectly, for my biology. My biology was not making an impression. So the only thing that would make an impression was my wit, which I'm all for it now. And I also remember I wore glasses. I was very nearsighted, but I didn't want to wear my glasses because I thought that they made me look even more homely. But then I remember I was in the 4th grade, and there was a girl who sat next to me. I even remember her name. Her name was Missy Raitt, and she was real pretty. She was just real. She was just one of those girls who had a real pretty face. She was a nice girl too, and she wore glasses. And I remember looking at her and realizing that it wasn't her glasses or the absence that made her pretty. She was just pretty. And taking off my glasses did not make me any prettier. It just made it harder for me to make it through life because I couldn't see anything. So I remember just putting on my glasses and just forgetting the whole thing. But as a result, I didn't get a lot of attention from boys. And attention from boys was pretty important when I was 12 and 13 years old. And I remember sitting at a party. I don't know what people do nowadays, but that somebody's basement rec room, somebody had a little party and they would play records and the boys would ask the girls to dance. And in those days, girls did not ask boys to dance. Girls did not dance with each other. It was a whole different era. So if a boy didn't ask you to dance, you sat against the wall. Thus the phrase wallflower. So I remember sitting against the wall, feeling sort of pathetic. And then I had this strange thought, and the thought was that I was very different from all the people around me. Now, we were living in El Paso, Texas, and I don't mean to cast aspersions on El Paso. Well, I do mean to cast aspersions on El Paso. It was not a place of high consciousness, especially among the children, because if you could walk across the border into Mexico, you could drink. So everybody started drinking really early. If one cheerleader made it through to the end of the senior year without getting pregnant, it was considered a great event. I mean, it was just an atmosphere that it was not an intellectual atmosphere, and I was a very intellectual person. And that was the least of it. It was not a place of expanded thinking. It may be different now, I don't know, but because we moved to California when I was 15, and as soon as I got to California, it was like, oh yeah, this is the world I was meant to live in. My parents felt the same. My father was stationed there during the war. There's a place called Fort Bliss, of all things, and he was stationed there. And by the time 5 years of being in the army there ended, they were established in the town. It took them another 15 to get to California. But in any case, I remember sitting there realizing that I was just different. Now I would use the phrase, I had a greater awareness. Intelligence wasn't the right word for it. It was just that I was just aware of possibilities in life, and the people around me just weren't. They were just, they were just taking life as it was given to them, making their way through it without ever questioning. And I was always searching for the meaning of things, and my family was much that way too. And I remember it was almost like the fairy godmother came to me and said, I could make you popular, but in order to be popular, you would have to give up this other part of yourself. I said, no, I'll just stay as I am. Even if I just sit against this wall alone for the rest of my life, I won't do it. It was very interesting. I mean, on one hand, you would just think, what was that? But I think something real happened in that moment that I was never tempted. So it wasn't like the devil really came and tempted me. It was just more like a kind of a glimpse, like this is what your life is going to be. Of course, I found my people and I found my tribe spectacularly when I met Swami Kriyananda when I was 22. And before that, I found some of my tribe. I found some of my tribe when I was about 18. And after that, I was not alone in the same way. But when I met Swami is when I really found my people. Now, all of this is about wisdom. And all of this is about, because when we think of the wisdom aspect of God, people often think of jnana yoga. And jnana yoga is somewhat misunderstood. Gyan yoga truthfully, is using the power of your awareness to just repudiate the reality of this world at all. The basic principle of jnana yoga is neti neti, not this, not this, not this. We're constantly discerning and putting things aside. Even in the Bhagavad Gita, in the commentary that Swami writes in various places about the verses, Krishna urges Arjuna to be a yogi because the path of gyan is very hard. Being a yogi is sort of, you start with accepting reality as it is, and then you work your way out of it. The gyan just stands aloof and refuses. It's a powerful path, but it's not exactly the same as the wisdom aspect of God. Now I'm amused. I'm thinking of something funny. When we were living at Ananda Village in the first 10 years or so, 15, probably the first 10 years, life was very austere. I never thought of it as austere. I thought of it as absolutely fabulous. But we had very few outlets, we just didn't have many outlets because we just lived there. We didn't have cars. We didn't have money. We didn't have anything. Halloween parties. The Halloween party every year was a really big deal. Swami would come. We'd all make fabulous costumes, and we just have this huge sort of funny, silly event that was completely out of character from everything else we did. The tradition of Halloween at Ananda Village has grown magnificently, and it still goes on. Now there's lots of children, and they do it for the children. We did it for ourselves in those days. And when I was part of the circle of nuns, one year, all the nuns, we went as cheerleaders for God. We had little sweaters and little skirts, and we had a little megaphone that said, "Yay, God," on it. And we had a little fight song, "Meditate for old Guru Dev, always be strong and always be brave. Be a soldier of the light and fight, 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 fight." We did energization exercises, to sort of do it like that. It was just crazy. But the year after, which is really the whole point, the year after, three of us one of my friends went as the sweet tooth, I went as the wisdom tooth, and my friend went as the tooth fairy. And that was and I had a bath brush, which was my big toothbrush, and I wore a little sign that said, "Neti, neti." This is where it comes from, because I was the wisdom tooth. Neti, neti, not this, not this. The sweet tooth, of course, was covered with fillings because, well, for obvious reasons. And the tooth fairy would just go around and bless people's molars. It was just a completely crazy. But anyway, back to Gyan Yoga is a very austere attitude toward life. Wisdom is the reason I'm saying this is because sometimes when I have tried to help people use the wisdom aspect more of life, they'll rebel against me. "Oh, you're a gyan, I'm a bhakti," someone will say to me, like meaning I go from my heart, you're just always thinking. No, that's not what wisdom is. Wisdom is clarity. That's all, just clarity. That's what we're trying to do. You can be very wise in your heart. You can be very wise in your intellect. But wisdom is clarity. Who am I? What am I doing? Why am I doing it? What are the principles that govern what I'm doing. You can come to them through using the power of reason and thought, which is, of course, I am temperamentally inclined that way. But you can also do it straight from the heart with intuition, that we just know. And once we know what is correct, we have the wisdom to be able to discern. I mean, why did Swami write 150 books? Why has he done thousands and thousands of videos and video courses, video lessons on everything that there is? Because when we can get the ideas clear in our mind, it's much easier to tell, what is right and what is wrong. I mean, even just the simple idea that values are directional, that the spiritual path is directional, and what is forward depends on where you're standing. That what we're trying to do is expand rather than contract. And you can see that somebody standing in one place, if you're thinking of a linear scale, expansion is a certain action, but somebody who's well past that same action would be contractive for them because they need to go on. Swami uses this example of if Mahatma Gandhi, in the middle of his efforts to free the country of India by peaceful means, if he suddenly thought, wow, I'm so well known, if I just go back to practicing as a lawyer, I'm going to get so many clients and get rich. There's not one person in the world who wouldn't think that he'd fallen. He'd fallen from where he was. But if your Uncle George, who's never done an honest day of work in his life, suddenly gets the idea that if he goes to law school and becomes a lawyer, he'll get rich, and he heads out and starts working hard and makes a great career as a lawyer, that's expansive for him because it just depends on where you're standing. Now, that's a somewhat obvious example, but here's one that's more complicated. Sometimes our external behavior looks harmonious, and this is something I have had to go through in my life. I appeared to be a harmonious person, but I wasn't a harmonious person. I was a frightened person. So harmony was not an expansive thing for me. Harmony was the way I kept myself contracted back in fear. And expansive for me was to be able to express myself, even if people didn't like what I had to say. And therefore, being nice was not a positive value for me. I had to learn to be a little bit reckless, heedless of other people's responses until I began to enjoy that. I enjoyed kind of making trouble and just saying what I wanted and not caring. And then I realized now it's become contractive for me to continue to do this. I mean, this happened even before I came to Ananda. This was just breaking out of my upbringing to a certain extent. But you see, how do you know those things? How can we know those things unless we have taken the trouble to really learn what the basic principles of the path are? We don't have to know everything. I was in India last, whenever it was. It seems like 100 years ago, but it was actually probably just about a year ago. And I was doing some courses, and I was in Mumbai with Shurjo and Narayani. And one of the courses I was doing was on the chakras. Well, I've been giving classes on the chakras for many years, and I feel comfortable with what I know. I learned it from Swamiji. I think it's very helpful. I've never, in all this time, and even to this minute, I do not know the Sanskrit names of the chakras because I just never felt that it mattered. I can call them the first, second, and third chakra, and I can call it what are the elements I want to say? The earth, water, fire, air. I know those words. I just don't know the Sanskrit names. And Shurjo and I were sort of sharing the program. He did a experiential part of it. And I basically mentioned to him that I just wasn't going to use the Sanskrit names because I didn't know them. Now, he's Indian, of course. And he said, you can't give a class on the chakras without the Sanskrit names. I said, watch me. It's going to happen. I said, you can use them because you know them. I've tried to learn them many times. I just can't hold them in my head. Yeah, watch me. So it's not like you have to know, it's not like you have to know all these details and you have to learn all these facts and be able to say all these obscure things or quote the Gita or whatever it is. You don't have to do any of that, but you need to know what you're doing. And you need to know why you're doing it. And you need to be able to discern when all the conflicting voices come into your mind. You need to be able to pull the principle out of it. And then when the principle is presented to you or you discover it, you have to understand what it means. That's what wisdom is. And it's a real useful skill. Because other times otherwise we just move around in vagueness. That's why, again, I come back to the word clarity. That's what wisdom is. It's clarity, clear thinking. Swamiji he never put up with foggy mindedness from us, just ever. I mean, it was, I say that emphatically. It's not that he was stern or that he was mean or anything like that. But when you didn't know what you were saying, he would vibrate this sort of like, hmm, hmm, and, or he would tactfully, but very clearly straighten you out. And I was extraordinarily fortunate in that I had the opportunity constantly to present to him what I was thinking. I had a very similar relationship with Jyotish at the same time. I could constantly put in front of them the ideas that were in my mind, and they would correct me, or they would clarify, or they would sometimes, see that I had a good point and help me to get that point even clearer. So it was training. It was not training in being intellectual. It was training in thinking clearly. So that's how we have to pull out the wisdom aspect. And if it's not it's not natural to your nature, then it's worth cultivating. Cultivating, as I'm saying it here, in the sense of, I need to know what I think. I need to know what I feel. I need to know how what I'm thinking and feeling relates to the highest principles. Because when you have a point of reference, that's what the whole spiritual path has been to me. It's been prior to the time that I met Swamiji, prior to the time when I was 18, when I was introduced to Sanatana Dharma. From 18 to 22, it's more like I was 19, almost 19 to 22, those 3 years there, I studied. And I also then started reading the lives of saints. After a year or so of studying the principles of Sanatana Dharma as presented by Vivekananda and Ramakrishna to an extent, I began to need to know, how do I use this? You see, that's the difference between just wisdom and intellectuality. Intellectuality just studies, is fascinated. It impresses people with what it knows. It can tie all these different things and refer to this scripture and that scripture and all these different. Whenever I have been in India, and I often reference the characters in the Mahabharata and the characters in the Ramayana. And it's, once again, it's not quite as bad as not knowing the Sanskrit names of the chakras, but it's close, because I know enough about those scriptures, and actually of those epics, and I actually know quite a bit. But compared to a person who grew up in India and was raised on these, I have like a quarter of an inch across the top. And I'll make some reference to a character, and somebody will come up and they'll just tell me 2 volumes worth of background material of who did what to whom, when, and how, and all this. And I love hearing it. These are stories. These are not intellectuality. But intellectuality is fascinated by the information. Wisdom says, all right, how does that affect my life? How does that make me a better person? How can I serve more? How can I be closer to God? How can I give more to people? How can I have more love? How can I have more joy? How can I have the other 8 aspects? Wisdom is the practical application of the principles involved. And so that's how I approach it. It's not that I'm not fascinated or that I don't enjoy all the incredible backstories about the Mahabharata characters. I do. I love them all. But what I know, what I've remembered of what I've learned, which is actually the way to put it, is that part which is practically helpful to me. And so when we're studying these teachings with the idea of developing the wisdom aspect of God, that's how it becomes useful. And so of the enormous wealth of information that's passed through my head, because I'm a reader by nature, and I had the good fortune, I mean, there was this girl who came to Ananda while Swami was still living. As it happened, she was pretty short. That was just coincidental. But Swami kept asked her if she'd read this book. No, sir, I haven't read that yet, of his. Have you read this one? No, sir, I haven't. And it got to be sort of a joke. And we were all at the dinner table, and I said, sir, if you stacked all your books up next to this poor girl, it would probably go over her head. I said, by the time she was a grown up, they were all written. I said, I was there. I got to read them one at a time as they were read. You know, it's overwhelming when you come in now and the stack of books is higher than you. So I've read all of Swami's books, in some cases multiple times, because I was there when he was writing them and he would send us the manuscripts. And I always made a point of reading whatever he sent and commenting on it, then reading the next version. It was my training as a writer. So the amount of information that I have that has passed through me compared to what I know. What I know is I mean, you can't even probably put your hands close enough together to say it. But what I've retained is that which helps me stay focused on the path. So that's what wisdom is. We need to read and study with the thought in our mind, what among this helps me? So even if you just get, you read a whole book and you get one idea, just one idea that really sticks with you. You really hear one class and you hear one idea and write it down and remember it as it's meaningful to you. And then as your life goes on, observe in terms of your ideas. And then your mind gets clearer and clearer and clearer. And then when you need it, it's in there. It's like everything else. It's a skill that you want to have at the ready. You don't want to wait till the karmic bomb goes off and you're trying to put the pieces of your life together and you can't remember what the blueprint is. You want to just have it really steady in yourself. Think about life in terms of the spiritual path. When you observe other people's behavior, and I highly recommend that you observe other people's behavior, not critically, not judgmentally, but just with interest. Swamiji says that's one of the great benefits of having a spiritual family, is that you don't have to do it all yourself. You don't have to make all the mistakes, and you don't have to demonstrate all the truths yourself. You can watch and see, look at the fruit of that positive attitude. Look at the negative consequences of that negative attitude. And you just keep learning the practical application of the teachings. So when you're stuck and can't quite figure out which way is up, I was in a very emotional situation where someone that I loved was really in a very hard spot. And people were looking to me to sort of keep it together. And I was not doing so well. And at the same time, I felt a responsibility and I wanted to. And I remember I found a private place, which happened to be my car in a parking lot. And I was just weeping and weeping and weeping because it was just all way too much for me. The responsibility, the situation itself, and this thought. I always point to my right ear because that's how I felt like a voice came in my right ear. It went through my mind like that, and then it exited out my left ear. And it said, do you think any of this could be happening outside the will of God? And now that's about the simplest principle we have, isn't it? But I'd forgotten. And as soon as that wisdom thought came through my mind, I had to stop crying because the answer to that was no, of course not. Then if it's the will of God, why are you weeping? Well, gee, I can't think of a really good reason, except, and then I had a good conversation with God, because people are suffering and I'm tired of it and I'm about at the end of my rope and I'm going to go down with the ship here. Something else is required. But I couldn't come to that until the wisdom thought went through my mind. You see, this is how we use it. Could this be outside the will of God? Okay, if this is God's will, then I have a big argument with God. But at least now I'm in integrity with what I actually believe, you see? And very interestingly, right after that, the whole situation started changing for the better. I think the whole thing happened on, I mean, it was all the divine timing, everybody's karma, but it was to remind me, you know, if you can't, I couldn't be joyful, I couldn't be loving, God knows I wasn't calm, and there was no peace anywhere, and the only sound was my wailing cries. But then the wisdom aspect came through and just put me right back where I needed to go. Didn't solve anything. I still had to face it, but now I knew which way was forward. Do you see? Invaluable, invaluable tools. Train ourselves. Let's train ourselves at all times. And then when the pressure builds, we have it within us